The German army used to mock the Sherman tank as a terrible tank, until the day German tank crews began hitting them accurately and watching them continue to advance. For years, destroying a Sherman meant only one thing: armor penetration, fire, a burning wreck left on the battlefield. German gunners trusted that outcome like sailors trust the tide. Then, at the end of the war, something shattered that certainty. American tank, armor-piercing rounds were as accurate as ever, but inside those tanks, the explosion everyone expected didn't happen. No fireballs, no instantaneous death, only convulsive crews, still alive, still fighting. When German intelligence finally tried to figure out what had changed, they found no thicker armor. They couldn't find a better gun. They found a solution that was too simple, too commonplace, so much so that it embarrassed some of the most experienced armored forces in Europe. A weakness for which the Sherman was once famous had quietly become the reason it refused to die. And when they realized that, the German commanders began to understand why. Their best machines always won duels, but still lost wars. The men inside the Sherman learned fear in a very specific way. It didn't arrive when the engine started. It didn't come when orders were given. It came in the moment after impact, when the world went silent for half a second, and everyone waited to see whether the tank would turn into a furnace. Early in the war, American tank crews did not measure danger by enemy accuracy. They measured it by what happened after penetration. A German round didn't need to blow the turret apart. It only needed to get inside. Inside the cramped steel hull, ammunition was stacked along the sides, and floor shells packed close, efficient for loading, efficient for killing. When a penetrator reached them, the result was instant and unforgiving. Fire raced through the compartment. Pressure spiked. Oxygen vanished. Crews had seconds, sometimes less. Veterans would later say the most terrifying part wasn't the hit itself. It was the pause afterward, that half-breath where you asked yourself one question. Is this the one? The Sherman earned its reputation quickly. German crews called them Ronsons after the lighter that promised to light every time. The nickname spread because it felt true. Penetrate a Sherman, and odds were the crew would never come out. Wrecks burned long after the fighting moved on, black columns of smoke marking where men had died trapped inside their own vehicle. American crews knew the reputation. They lived with it. Before going into combat, men quietly memorized escape routes inside the tank: who moved first, who followed, who climbed which hatch. Some carried knives not for fighting, but to cut through jammed straps or burning gear. Others rehearsed the motion of unbuckling their seat belts in the dark, upside down, with their hands shaking. This fear changed how Shermans fought long before any enemy shell hit them. Tank commanders kept their distance, even when closing in would have been tactically better. Gunners hesitated before firing from exposed positions. Crews abandoned tanks that were still mechanically recoverable because no one wanted to wait inside a damaged hull for the fire that might come next. Every decision was filtered through a single thought: if we're hit, we burn. By 1943 and early 1944, the U.S. Army had data to prove what crews already felt in their bones. After-action reports told a grim story. When Shermans were penetrated, ammunition fires occurred at a rate far higher than comparable German tanks. In too many cases, the tank itself wasn't the loss the crew was. Experienced men, trained gunners, seasoned commanders disappeared in seconds, replaced by rookies who lasted weeks, sometimes days. The tank could be replaced. The crew could not. This created a quiet crisis no one liked to talk about. The Sherman was not failing in the way critics later claimed. It was mobile, reliable, easy to maintain. It did what it was designed to do: support infantry, move fast, exist in large numbers. But inside, it was killing its own men. Commanders understood the dilemma even if they didn't always say it aloud. The United States was winning by production and momentum. Tanks were needed everywhere: Normandy, Italy, training units preparing for the invasion of France. Any change that slowed production was viewed as a threat not just to schedules, but to strategy itself. Yet every burned-out Sherman represented more than a destroyed vehicle. It represented a loss of experience the Army could not easily replace. Men who knew how to read terrain, men who stayed calm under fire, men who had survived long enough to be dangerous. By the time American forces landed in Normandy, many crews entered combat with a fatalistic understanding of their odds. They joked about it, because joking was easier than admitting fear. But the fear shaped everything. Then, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, that fear began to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish overnight. There was no moment where crews suddenly felt invincible. But something subtle changed. Tanks began to take hits that should have ended them. Crews braced for the fire, and it didn't come. Men stumbled out of hatches, coughing, shaken, alive. Tanks that would once have been tombs became damaged machines that could still move, still shoot, still be recovered. At first, no one trusted it. Veterans assumed luck, a bad angle, a faulty German round. Anything except the idea that the Sherman itself had changed. Superstition filled the gap where understanding did not yet exist. But after it happened again, and again, and again, patterns began to form. Crews who should have been dead were not. Units that should have been shattered were still fighting. And confidence, something no engineer could manufacture, started to return. Men stayed in their tanks longer. They closed distance they would once have avoided. They accepted hits that would previously have sent them running. Not because the Sherman had become stronger, but because, for the first time, it no longer felt like a death sentence the moment it was penetrated. What most of those men did not know, what even many commanders could not clearly explain, was why this change was happening. The answer was not in the gun, not in the armor, not in any dramatic redesign visible from the outside. It was hidden beneath the floor plates, behind the bulkheads, wrapped around the very ammunition that had once doomed them. And the consequences of that hidden change would ripple far beyond individual crews, reshaping tactics, confidence, and the tempo of an entire army as it pushed toward the heart of Germany. By the time American forces reached France, the problem was no longer anecdotal. It was statistical. Reports coming back from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy told the same story again and again. Shermans were being penetrated at expected rates, but what happened afterward was unacceptable. Too many tanks didn't just stop fighting. They burned. And when they burned, crews rarely escaped intact. The U.S. Army could replace a tank in days. Replacing a trained crew took months. Inside staff offices far from the front, stacks of after-action reports began to paint a picture commanders did not like. These were not emotional accounts from shaken survivors. They were dry summaries, penetration angles, hit locations, ammunition ignition rates, casualty tallies, and the numbers pointed to a single, uncomfortable truth. The Sherman's greatest weakness was not German firepower. It was what happened inside the tank once that firepower succeeded. Early Sherman designs stored ammunition wherever space allowed, along the hull walls, beneath the turret basket, near the floor. It made sense from a production and ergonomic standpoint. Shells were accessible, reloads were faster, manufacturing was simpler, but combat had exposed the cost of that convenience. When a German round penetrated the armor, it didn't need to detonate perfectly. It only needed to reach the interior. Fragments and spall ripped through the fighting compartment, striking propellant charges and high explosive shells packed tightly together. Once one ignited, the rest followed. The tank became an oven. By late 1943, American analysts could no longer dismiss this as bad luck or early war growing pains. Comparisons with German tanks were unavoidable. Panzer crews were often killed by penetration, but their tanks burned far less frequently. Ammunition in German designs was stored lower, better shielded, sometimes separated from the crew by armored bulkheads. The conclusion was obvious. Admitting it was not. The Sherman was the backbone of American armored forces. Thousands were already in service. Tens of thousands more were scheduled for production. Any major redesign threatened to disrupt the one advantage the United States possessed in overwhelming measure: numbers. Factories in Detroit and beyond were operating at full capacity. Production lines were tuned to efficiency, measured in minutes. Every change, every additional component meant retraining workers, retooling machines, slowing output. To civilian executives and some military planners, the math was brutal but simple. A slower production line meant fewer tanks at the front. Fewer tanks meant fewer breakthroughs. Fewer breakthroughs meant a longer war. Crew survivability, while tragic, was harder to quantify in spreadsheets. But on the ground, commanders were already paying the price. Veteran crews were disappearing faster than replacements could absorb lessons. Units that should have been sharpening their edge were instead constantly rebuilding from scratch. New crews arrived eager but inexperienced, forced to learn under fire what others had learned and died learning months earlier. This churn quietly weakened American armored units even as their numbers grew. The Army Ordnance Department understood the stakes better than anyone. Engineers and analysts were tasked with finding a solution that did not require reinventing the Sherman from the ground up. The tank could not afford a radical redesign, not with an invasion of Western Europe looming. The question became narrower, sharper, more dangerous. Could the Sherman be made safer without slowing the war effort? Tests were ordered. Hulls were deliberately shot at using captured German anti-tank guns. Engineers measured not just penetration, but what happened next. Fires spread, pressure spikes, survival windows measured in seconds. The results were damning and clarifying. In most catastrophic losses, it was not the initial penetration that killed the crew. It was the secondary event. Ammunition, ignition. Stop that, and survival rates improved dramatically, even when the tank itself was disabled. The implication was radical in its simplicity. The Sherman did not need to become invulnerable. It needed to stop killing its crew after it had already been hit. But simplicity did not make the solution easy to accept. Any change to ammunition storage raised immediate objections. More protection meant more weight. More weight meant slower tanks. Slower tanks meant greater vulnerability to German guns. Everything was connected. There was also the unspoken fear of admitting a design flaw in the middle of a global war. Public confidence, Allied morale, and political pressure all hovered in the background. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a symbol of American industrial power. Yet the reports kept coming. Burned-out hulls, charred interiors, crews lost in tanks that could have been abandoned if fire had not erupted instantly. Eventually, the conversation shifted. Not from whether the problem existed, but from whether the Army could afford to ignore it any longer. Senior officers began asking a different question. Not how many tanks could be built, but how many experienced crews could be kept alive long enough to matter. How many veterans would still be fighting 6 months from now? How many hard-earned lessons would survive the next engagement? It was a quiet shift, but a decisive one. The Army was beginning to realize that winning the war was not only about putting steel on the battlefield, but about keeping the men inside that steel alive long enough to learn, adapt, and fight again. The solution that followed would not look impressive on paper. It would not make headlines. It would not change the silhouette of the Sherman at all, but it would redefine what survival inside a tank meant. And it would force the United States to choose between building tanks faster or losing fewer men. The solution did not arrive as a breakthrough. It arrived as an argument. Inside ordnance offices and factory floors, engineers circled the same problem from every angle, hoping for a fix that wouldn't cost time, weight, or output. None existed. Any change that improved survivability demanded a trade-off, and in 1943, trade-offs were dangerous. The Sherman had been designed to be simple, fast to build, and easy to maintain. Ammunition was placed where crews could reach it quickly. It made sense in peacetime logic. It made sense in production math. It failed under fire. When engineers mapped out every catastrophic loss, a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. Penetration alone did not kill most crews. Ammunition ignition did. Stop the ignition, and the tank, even damaged, became survivable. The first proposals were blunt and unpopular. Move the ammunition, shield it, separate it from the crew, surround it with something that could absorb heat and fragments before the propellant caught. Every option added weight. Every option added complexity. Every option slowed production. Factory managers pushed back immediately. Production lines were calibrated to minutes, not margins. Adding protective structures meant redesigning racks, retraining workers, changing supply chains already stretched thin. The Sherman's greatest advantage numbers was suddenly at risk. Then someone proposed water. Not armor, not exotic alloys. Water. The idea sounded almost insulting in its simplicity. If fragments and heat were igniting propellant, then interpose something that could absorb both. Surround the ammunition racks with jackets filled with water and antifreeze. Force a penetrating round to lose energy before it reached the shells. Cool the fragments. Smother the flash. On paper, it was inelegant. On a battlefield, it might save lives. Tests were ordered, and for the first time, the debate shifted from theory to evidence. At proving grounds, Sherman hulls were loaded with ammunition and deliberately shot at using captured German anti-tank guns. Engineers watched what happened next. Sensors measured temperature spikes. Cameras recorded ignition sequences. Crews stood ready with extinguishers, expecting fire. With dry storage, the results were familiar. Penetration was followed by ignition. Pressure built. Flames tore through the fighting compartment. With water-jacketed storage, something different happened. Rounds penetrated. Fragments entered. But the expected chain reaction failed to materialize. Ammunition that should have ignited did not. Fires that should have spread died out. In controlled conditions, the difference was unmistakable. The numbers were not subtle. Ammunition fires dropped sharply. Survival windows widened. Crews had time to escape, time to fight, time to live. But success in testing created a new problem. Water jackets added weight. Not much individually, but enough to matter. Speed dropped slightly. Range narrowed. On a spec sheet, the Sherman looked worse, not better. In a war where German tanks already outgunned and out-armored American designs, that was a hard sell. Some officers objected on principle. Tanks were supposed to fight, not absorb punishment. Others worried about logistics. Water froze. Antifreeze was another supply item, another failure point, and beneath it all was a deeper resistance, admitting that the Sherman needed saving at all. Yet the evidence refused to go away. Engineers did not argue that wet stowage would make the Sherman superior to Panthers or Tigers. They argued something far more modest and far more threatening to old assumptions. They argued it would keep crews alive. That argument reached senior leadership at the worst possible moment. The invasion of Western Europe was approaching. Production targets were locked in. Any disruption risked cascading delays across the entire Allied timetable. The pressure to do nothing to accept losses as the price of war was immense, and yet, so was the pressure from the field. Reports continued to arrive describing tanks that were technically destroyed but tactically useful machines that could have been recovered if they hadn't burned. Crews that might have lived if given seconds more. The decision ultimately came down to priorities. Build more tanks faster, or keep experienced crews alive longer. The order, when it came, was unremarkable on its face. No speeches, no public announcements, just a directive moving through the system. New Sherman variants would incorporate revised ammunition storage. Production lines would adjust. The change would be phased in quietly, and it would be kept quiet. Operational security became part of the fix. If the enemy learned what had changed, they might adapt aim differently, develop new tactics, compensate. Better that they continue fighting the Sherman they thought they knew. Factories began implementing the change. Workers installed new racks. Water jackets were filled and sealed. Tanks rolled off the lines, looking identical to their predecessors, carrying a secret that even many crews would not fully understand. The Sherman did not announce its transformation. There was no visible difference on the battlefield. No new silhouette to photograph. No obvious marker to identify the safer tanks from the outside. Which meant the first men to discover the difference would do so the hard way. By being hit, the Army did not expect miracles. Engineers did not promise invulnerability. The Sherman would still be penetrated. Crews would still die. War did not allow clean solutions. But the calculus had changed. A penetrating hit no longer guaranteed fire. Fire no longer guaranteed death. And death no longer came as quickly or as often. The fix nobody wanted was now embedded in the most common American tank of the war. It was unglamorous, invisible, and quietly revolutionary. What remained was to see whether it would work where it mattered most. Not on proving grounds, not in reports, but under live fire, against enemies who still believed the Sherman burned the way it always had. The next time a shell punched through American armor, the battlefield would deliver its verdict. The first crews who discovered the difference were not told in advance. No briefing explained what had changed. No manual prepared them for what was about to happen. They learned the truth the only way soldiers ever do, when something goes wrong, and they survive it. The engagement began like dozens before it. Shermans advanced cautiously, engines rumbling low, tracks grinding through mud and hedgerows. German anti-tank positions were well sighted, overlapping fields of fire covering the approaches. This was familiar ground, familiar danger. Inside the lead tank, the crew felt the tension settle in the way it always did. Hands tightened around controls, eyes fixed on periscopes and sights. Everyone knew the routine. Everyone knew the risk. Then the hit came, a sharp metallic crack, a violent jolt, the kind of impact that told you the armor had been penetrated. For a split second, no one moved. That pause, the one every Sherman crew feared, arrived right on time. Men waited for the heat, for the pressure, for the roar that meant there would be no second chance. It didn't come. The air inside the tank filled with dust and smoke, but not fire. The compartment shuddered and rang like a struck bell, yet the walls did not glow, and the floor did not erupt beneath their feet. The loader coughed. The gunner swore. The driver realized his hands were still on the controls. They were alive. Not untouched, not safe, but alive. For a moment, disbelief took over. Crews were conditioned to assume the worst after penetration. Training, experience, and rumor all reinforced the same expectation. Once the shell got inside, the tank became a coffin. But now, the coffin hadn't closed. The commander shouted orders that surprised even himself. The gun stayed in action. The tank continued to move. What should have been a fatal moment turned into a damaged but fighting one. Nearby crews saw it happen. They saw a Sherman take a hit that should have ended it and keep going. They watched hatches stay shut instead of bursting open in panic. They noticed the absence of fire, the lack of the familiar black smoke. At first, they didn't trust it. Combat breeds superstition as much as it breeds courage. Some crews assumed it was luck. Others blamed faulty German ammunition. A few whispered that maybe the angle had been wrong. But then it happened again. Another penetration, another pause, another tank that did not burn. Across separate units, under different conditions, the same pattern repeated. Tanks that should have become funeral pyres became damaged machines instead. Crews escaped burns that would once have been unavoidable. Some stayed in the fight long enough to return fire. Others withdrew under their own power. The battlefield reacted before doctrine ever could. Confidence crept back in, not as bravado, but as something quieter and more dangerous. Willingness. Crews were willing to stay put a little longer, willing to press forward instead of immediately pulling back, willing to trust that being hit did not automatically mean dying. German gunners noticed the change too, though they did not understand it. From their positions, the fight looked wrong. Rounds landed cleanly. Penetrations were achieved. The mechanics of the kill were familiar, yet the result was missing. Shermans absorbed hits and refused to perform their expected role as burning wrecks. Anti-tank crews fired again, adjusting aim, convinced the first shot had simply failed to finish the job. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. This was deeply unsettling. German anti-tank tactics relied on psychological certainty as much as technical superiority. The moment a Sherman burned, nearby American crews hesitated. Momentum stalled. Positions held. Now that certainty began to erode. A Sherman that stayed alive stayed dangerous. A crew that survived a penetration remained a threat. Each failed burn forced German gunners to stay exposed longer, fire more rounds, and reveal their positions. What had once been a predictable exchange became unstable. For American crews, the realization came slowly, almost reluctantly. No one announced that the Sherman had become safer. No memo declared the problem solved. Men learned through experience, one hit at a time, that the rules they had lived under were no longer absolute. Penetration did not always mean fire. Fire did not always mean death. The change was not dramatic enough to inspire celebration. It was subtle enough to change behavior. Crews began closing distances they would have avoided months earlier. Commanders accepted risks they once would not have taken. Damaged tanks were recovered instead of written off. Veterans stayed in the line instead of being replaced by green men. None of this happened because the Sherman suddenly won duels it had always lost. It happened because, for the first time, the tank gave its crew a chance to survive long enough to adapt. What German commanders saw as an inexplicable failure, American crews experienced as something far more personal: hope. Not the loud, reckless kind. The quiet kind that makes men stay in place when instinct tells them to run. That single change, the absence of fire where fire had always been, marked the real beginning of the Sherman's transformation. And it was only just beginning to ripple outward. The most dangerous part of the change was not that it happened. It was that the Germans never clearly saw it. From the German perspective, nothing fundamental had shifted. Their guns still penetrated Sherman armor. Their gunners were still trained, experienced, and deadly. By every technical measure they trusted, the battlefield was behaving as expected. And yet, the results no longer matched the inputs. Reports began to accumulate at divisional and corps headquarters, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Shermans were being hit, sometimes multiple times, but fewer were burning. Crews were escaping. Units that should have been shattered were still present hours later. German commanders did what professionals always do when something feels wrong. They looked for familiar explanations. Perhaps American crews had improved their discipline. Perhaps new tactics emphasized withdrawal before catastrophic loss. Perhaps the angles of engagement had changed. None of those explanations fully fit the evidence. German intelligence officers faced a deeper problem. Their entire assessment framework for the Sherman was built on data that was no longer current. For years, German evaluations of American armor had been accurate, brutally so. Early Shermans burned at alarming rates when penetrated. Wrecks recovered from North Africa and Italy confirmed it. Interrogations of captured American crews reinforced it. Tactical manuals were updated accordingly. The Sherman was classified as vulnerable, flammable, and psychologically fragile. That classification became doctrine. Anti-tank tactics were designed around it. Penetrate the hull, and the job was largely done. Fire would follow, the crew would be neutralized. The tank would be removed from the battlefield without the need for repeated exposure. When that outcome stopped occurring reliably, German intelligence did not immediately assume a technical breakthrough. They assumed noise in the data. One reason was sampling bias. The Sherman tanks that fell into German hands late in the war were not representative. Many damaged vehicles were recovered by American maintenance crews under fire. Others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The few that remained intact enough for inspection were often older variants, exactly the models German analysts already understood. Every captured Sherman seemed to confirm existing beliefs. The newer tanks, the ones that mattered, rarely stayed behind long enough to be examined. Another reason was timing. By late 1944, German intelligence was fighting a war of triage. Resources were stretched across collapsing fronts. Experienced technical officers had been killed, reassigned, or diverted to higher priority concerns, particularly air warfare. What remained was an overworked system trying to analyze too many threats with too few specialists. Tank survivability did not feel urgent compared to fuel shortages, collapsing supply lines, and overwhelming Allied numbers. There was also a psychological trap. German armored forces had spent years reinforcing the belief that their technical superiority compensated for numerical inferiority. The Panther, the Tiger, the Jagdpanzer, these machines formed the backbone of German confidence. Accepting that a simple American modification had undermined a key tactical advantage was more than an analytical challenge. It was an emotional one. If the Sherman no longer burned the way it used to, then German anti-tank doctrine was outdated. If doctrine was outdated, then experience, the hard-earned instincts of veteran gunners, was suddenly less reliable. That was a dangerous thought in a war already turning against them. So reports were filed. Concerns were noted. Requests for further analysis were submitted. And then, too often, they stalled. Frontline commanders complained that American tanks were behaving abnormally. Intelligence officers asked for priority access to captured vehicles that never arrived. Higher headquarters acknowledged the problem without fully grasping its cause. Meanwhile, the battlefield continued to deliver the same quiet message. Shermans were being penetrated and remaining operational longer. Crews were surviving hits that should have killed them. Engagements were lasting longer than expected. German gunners adapted in small ways, firing additional rounds, adjusting aim, calling for heavier weapons. But without understanding why the tanks were behaving differently, these adaptations were inefficient. They treated the symptom, not the cause. The most damaging failure was not ignorance, but delay. Even when some German officers began to suspect a change in ammunition, storage, or internal layout, there was no time left to respond effectively. Redesigning tactics required confirmation. Confirmation required captured examples. Captured examples were scarce, and time was the one resource Germany no longer possessed. By the time the pattern was undeniable, the war had already moved past the point where adaptation could matter. The Americans did not win this advantage by deception alone. They won it by moving faster through the cycle of failure, learning, and correction. German intelligence had once excelled at rapid technical analysis. Early in the war, new enemy weapons were disassembled and understood within days. But by late 1944, that system was exhausted, trapped by outdated assumptions and overwhelmed by events. The result was a quiet catastrophe. German anti-tank crews went into battle believing they understood the Sherman. They believed penetration meant victory. They believed fire would follow. When it didn't, confusion set in. Confidence eroded. Engagements became longer, riskier, and more costly. The Americans did not need the Sherman to be invincible. They only needed the Germans to keep fighting yesterday's tank, and that is exactly what happened. By the time German commanders realized they were misreading the battlefield, the damage was already done, not to their equipment, but to their ability to adapt. The Sherman had not become a better tank in the way German doctrine defined better. We have a snowed. It had become a problem they no longer understood. The change did not announce itself with confident speeches or new manuals. It revealed itself in behavior. At first, it was barely noticeable, small deviations from habit that only veterans would recognize. A tank that stayed in place a few seconds longer after being hit. A commander who chose to keep advancing instead of backing out. A gunner who kept firing rather than freezing, waiting for fire that never came. These were not acts of bravery. They were acts of trust. Trust that a penetrating hit did not automatically mean death. Trust that the tank, for all its flaws, would give them a chance. Before, Sherman crews fought with a constant internal clock ticking down to catastrophe. Once hit, that clock usually ran out fast. The safest instinct was withdrawal distance, caution, survival through avoidance. Now the clock slowed. Crews discovered they could absorb punishment without instantly losing the fight, and once that realization set in, it changed how they thought about everything else. Commanders began closing distance deliberately. This was not recklessness. It was calculation. The Sherman had never been built to win long-range duels against German heavy armor. Its strength lay in numbers, coordination, and sustained pressure. Those advantages only mattered if the tank could remain in action long enough to use them. Improved survivability unlocked that possibility. Instead of skirting the edges of engagement envelopes, American tanks began pushing into them. Where crews once tried to trade shots from maximum range, hoping not to be seen, they now advanced aggressively, accepting hits as part of the cost of maintaining momentum. The difference was subtle but profound. A tank that expects to burn fights cautiously. A tank that expects to survive fights decisively. Crews learned that damage did not necessarily end the mission. A penetrated tank could still maneuver. A stunned crew could recover. A fight did not have to be abandoned at the first sign of trouble. This confidence was contagious. Veteran commanders passed it down through example rather than instruction. New crews watched older men stay in their tanks after hits and realized the rules had changed. Units that had once fragmented under fire now held cohesion longer. The battlefield began to feel different. German anti-tank crews found themselves under sustained pressure. Instead of firing once and relocating, they were forced to fire repeatedly at targets that refused to disappear. Each additional shot meant more exposure. Each moment spent engaging a surviving Sherman increased the risk of counterfire, artillery response, or flanking maneuvers. Time, which had once favored the defender, began to favor the attacker. This shift had tactical consequences that rippled outward. American armored units became more willing to conduct close-range engagements, using terrain and movement rather than distance as protection. Shermans advanced in mutually supporting formations, knowing that losing one tank did not automatically shatter the unit. Damaged vehicles were recovered more often. Crews survived to fight again. Experience accumulated instead of being erased. The U.S. Army had not merely reduced losses, it had increased continuity. That continuity mattered. Experienced crews made fewer mistakes. They communicated better. They reacted faster under fire. Their presence raised the baseline effectiveness of entire formations. Before, the Sherman's reputation had imposed an invisible ceiling on performance. Crews hesitated because hesitation felt rational. Now that ceiling lifted. The most important transformation was psychological. Fear did not vanish. No tank crew ever became comfortable being shot at. But fear changed shape. It became manageable, predictable, something to work around instead of surrender to. Men who expected death fought to avoid it. Men who expected survival fought to win. American commanders began noticing the difference in reports and outcomes. Engagements ended faster. Positions fell with fewer pauses. Tank units pressed through defenses that would once have stalled advances for hours or days. This did not mean Shermans were suddenly winning duels against tigers and panthers. They still lost those fights when isolated. But isolation became rarer. Survivability allowed coordination. Coordination allowed mass. Mass overwhelmed quality. The Sherman's design philosophy finally had room to breathe. Numbers mattered again not as expendable assets, but as sustained presence. A force that stayed intact longer exerted pressure longer. German defenses bent instead of resetting. What German commanders perceived as inexplicable resilience was, in reality, a chain reaction. One crew surviving led to another staying in place. One tank continuing to fight forced another German gun to stay exposed. Small survivability gains compounded into operational momentum. The effect was most visible in prolonged engagements. Battles no longer reset after each exchange. American units could fight, recover, and fight again without withdrawing to rebuild from scratch. This persistence wore down defenders who were already short on fuel, ammunition, and replacements. The Sherman had not become a killing machine, it had become a staying machine. And staying power, in a war of attrition, was decisive. As confidence spread, doctrine followed slowly, cautiously, but inevitably. Commanders encouraged aggressive movement supported by overlapping fires. Tank infantry cooperation improved as armored units could remain close without constant fear of catastrophic loss. Even logistics felt the change. Fewer total write-offs meant maintenance units worked more recoveries and fewer replacements. Supply chains stabilized. Training pipelines eased slightly as experienced crews stayed alive to mentor newcomers. All of this stemmed from a single shift in expectation. Not that the Sherman would win every fight, but that it would give its crew a chance to survive long enough to learn how to fight better. The Germans never fully grasped this transformation while it was happening. They saw stubborn tanks and aggressive tactics, but not the quiet psychological recalibration behind them. By the time the pattern was clear, American armored units were no longer fighting the war the same way they had in Normandy. They were fighting forward. And that forward momentum would soon be tested under the harshest conditions imaginable, in a battle designed to break tanks, break morale, and destroy any advantage built on survivability. The question was no longer whether the Sherman could keep its crews alive after being hit. It was whether that survivability could hold under sustained, overwhelming pressure. If there was any place the new reality would fail, it would fail here. The Ardennes, in winter, offered no forgiveness. Forests choked movement. Roads funneled armor into narrow corridors. Snow muffled sound and swallowed vehicles whole. Visibility vanished. Cold punished engines and men alike. And in December 1944, German forces chose this terrain for one last gamble. The offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was designed to do exactly what American armor feared most: force prolonged engagements under overwhelming pressure. German planners intended to shatter Allied momentum, isolate units, and destroy armored forces faster than they could be replaced. For Sherman crews, this was the nightmare scenario. limited maneuver space, close-range anti-tank ambushes, sustained contact instead of brief clashes. In earlier campaigns, these conditions had been lethal. Tanks caught in forest roads or village choke points rarely had room to disengage. Penetration meant fire. Fire meant crews lost. Units collapsed not because they were outgunned, but because they were erased too quickly to adapt. This time, something was different. When German armor surged forward through the fog and snow, Sherman units did not evaporate the way planners expected. Tanks were hit often repeatedly, but fewer burned. Crews stayed inside damaged vehicles long enough to fight, reposition, or withdraw in order rather than panic. The Bulge became the first true endurance test of the Sherman's quiet transformation. German attacks were violent and sudden. Anti-tank guns waited at close range. Panzer formations pressed aggressively, confident in their experience of American armor. When they achieved penetration, they expected the familiar results. But the battlefield did not cooperate. Sherman's absorbed punishment that would once have annihilated them. Crews survived hits that would previously have ended their participation in the fight within seconds. Damaged tanks clogged roads not as flaming wrecks, but as obstacles that still had crews capable of coordinating defenses. This mattered enormously in defensive combat. Holding ground required time. Time to bring up infantry. Time to adjust artillery. Time to organize counterattacks. In earlier battles, burning tanks denied defenders all three. Now, survivability bought minutes. Minutes bought coordination. Coordination bought resistance. In villages and road junctions across the Ardennes, small groups of Shermans delayed German advances far longer than planners had anticipated. Not because they were invincible, but because they refused to disappear immediately after being hit. German crews began encountering a new problem. Anti-tank ambushes that should have cleared roads instead produced stubborn resistance. Vehicles that should have become psychological weapons, burning symbols of defeat, became damaged hulks, still contributing to the fight. Each failure to destroy a tank cleanly forced German units to linger longer in exposed positions. Each delay allowed American defenses to stiffen. The weather amplified the effect. Snow and cold slowed everything. Movement was difficult. Recovery operations were harder. Every surviving crew mattered more than usual because replacing them took longer. In these conditions, survivability was not a luxury, it was a force multiplier. American tank units learned this quickly. Crews remained in contact longer than doctrine once advised. Damaged tanks were used as static fire positions rather than abandoned immediately. Commanders accepted losses in exchange for time, knowing their crews were less likely to be lost outright. This was a dangerous adaptation, but one made possible by survivability. The German offensive relied on momentum. It needed breakthroughs to cascade. It needed defenders to collapse fast enough to prevent coordinated responses. Instead, it encountered resistance that lingered. Sherman units that should have been written off after the first exchange continued to influence the battlefield hours later. They blocked roads. They covered retreats. They anchored infantry positions. None of this would have been possible if those tanks had burned the way they once did. German commanders noticed the change, but too late. Reports from the front described American armor that refused to die properly. Penetrations achieved, kills expected, but results delayed or incomplete. Tanks that were supposed to vanish continued to complicate the fight. This eroded confidence at precisely the wrong moment. The Bulge demanded ruthless efficiency. Every delay worked against German plans. Every stubborn pocket of resistance consumed fuel, ammunition, and time resources already in short supply. As days passed, the offensive slowed. American forces absorbed the shock, stabilized their lines, and began counterattacking. Sherman units, battered but intact enough to function, played a critical role in holding key positions and supporting infantry under siege. The transformation was not dramatic. There were no sweeping armored victories credited to wet stowage. No decisive duel where a Sherman emerged triumphant against a superior foe. Instead, there was something quieter and more devastating. The German offensive failed to achieve the collapse it required. Survivability had turned what should have been catastrophic losses into manageable damage. It kept experienced crews in the fight during the most demanding conditions of the campaign. It allowed American units to endure pressure long enough to respond intelligently. By the time German forces began to withdraw, the pattern was unmistakable. Sherman tanks had not saved the Ardennes by overpowering the enemy. They had done it by refusing to disappear. For the first time, the advantage provided by improved survivability was visible at the operational level. Not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a denial of German hopes. The Bulge was meant to prove that American armor could be shattered under pressure. Instead, it proved something else. A tank that survives long enough to keep fighting even while damaged can shape battles far larger than itself. And after the Ardennes, American commanders no longer wondered whether the Sherman's quiet improvement mattered. They had seen what happened when it was tested to the limit. The final question was no longer whether survivability could endure, it was how far its consequences would carry as the war moved into its last, desperate phase. What changed after the Ardennes was not the Sherman, it was the tempo of the war. Once the German offensive collapsed, Allied forces did not pause for long recovery in the way earlier campaigns had required. Units refitted, reorganized, and moved forward with a confidence that had been absent months earlier. The difference lay not in new equipment, but in continuity. Sherman crews were still being hit. Tanks were still being damaged. But fewer crews were being erased from the battlefield altogether. That single fact reshaped everything that followed. Experienced men stayed in their units. Veteran gunners who knew how to spot anti-tank positions survived long enough to teach newcomers. Commanders who understood how to maneuver under fire remained in command instead of being replaced mid-campaign. Small habits, how to angle a hull, when to push, when to pause, accumulated instead of vanishing in flames. This accumulation of experience was subtle, but its effects were profound. Armored units that once needed time to rebuild after every major engagement now recovered faster. A damaged tank could be repaired. A shaken crew could rest and return. What had once been catastrophic losses became attritional ones. Attrition favored the Allies. As the advance resumed across Western Europe, American armored formations maintained pressure with fewer interruptions. Roads that once filled with burned-out wrecks now filled with damaged vehicles being towed forward for repair. Supply columns adjusted. Maintenance units shifted from replacing total losses to restoring combat power. This changed how operations were planned. Commanders could assume that units would still exist tomorrow. That assumption sounds small, but in war it determines everything. It allowed tighter schedules, bolder objectives, and fewer pauses. Momentum became a planning factor rather than a hope. German defenses felt the change immediately. Positions that might once have stopped an advance for days were now held for hours. Sherman units could probe, withdraw, and probe again without being shattered in the process. Infantry support became more reliable because tanks remained present instead of disappearing after the first exchange. The battlefield began to compress. German forces, already short on fuel and replacements, struggled to cope with a pace that no longer gave them time to recover. Anti-tank units were forced to relocate more frequently. Defensive lines were penetrated not by overwhelming firepower, but by sustained presence. This presence mattered most during deep advances. As Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine, tank units operated farther from major depots and replacement pools. In earlier campaigns, this depth would have been dangerous. Tanks lost to fire could not easily be replaced. Crews lost could not be replaced at all. Now, survivability provided a margin of safety. Damaged tanks could be kept in action longer or recovered later. Crews survived long enough to adapt to unfamiliar terrain and resistance. The operational reach of armored units expanded because the risk of total collapse diminished. German intelligence continued to misinterpret what they were seeing. Reports attributed the Allied advance to superior numbers, overwhelming logistics, or declining German morale. All of those factors were real. None explained why American armored units seemed increasingly resilient at the tactical level. What was missing from their analysis was the cumulative effect of survivability. A tank that does not burn does not merely save a crew. It preserves knowledge. It preserves confidence. It preserves momentum. Those preserved elements compounded day after day, engagement after engagement. By early 1945, American armored units were no longer fighting as collections of individual tanks. They fought as cohesive systems crews, maintenance, logistics, and command, operating in rhythm. That rhythm depended on continuity. The Sherman's reputation as a disposable weapon no longer matched reality. Crews treated their tanks as assets worth preserving, not expendable shells. Maintenance units worked with the expectation that damaged vehicles would return. Commanders planned with the assumption that experience would remain in the line. This altered the psychological balance of the battlefield. German defenders increasingly faced armored units that did not lose effectiveness after the first clash. Resistance that once relied on attrition now worked against itself. Every failed attempt to destroy American armor outright left the defenders weaker and more exposed. The result was not spectacular victory after spectacular victory. It was something far more decisive. The Allied advance became relentless. As bridges were crossed and cities approached, American armor maintained pressure without the long pauses that had characterized earlier operations. German forces were pushed back faster than they could re-establish coherent defenses. When Allied units reached the Rhine, the significance of survivability was undeniable. Tanks that had been in continuous service for months remained operational. Crews who had survived multiple engagements carried with them a confidence born not of arrogance, but of hard experience. Survivability had altered the arithmetic of war. Instead of exchanging tanks for ground, the Allies now exchanged damage for ground. Instead of losing crews, they lost parts. Instead of resetting units, they reinforced them. The Sherman had not become a wonder weapon. It had become a reliable one. And reliability, at this stage of the war, was decisive. What began as a technical fix to a deadly flaw had evolved into a strategic advantage, one that reshaped how the final campaigns unfolded. Yet, for the enemy, the reason for this change remained elusive. German commanders continued fighting an American tank they believed they understood, even as the battlefield proved otherwise. The opportunity to adapt had passed. As Allied forces prepared to cross into the heart of Germany, the consequences of that misunderstanding became irreversible. The final phase of the war would not be decided by who built the strongest tank. It would be decided by who kept experienced crews alive long enough to keep moving forward. By the time the war entered its final months, the change was complete, and almost no one was talking about it. There was no announcement declaring the Sherman redeemed, no official doctrine that reframed its reputation. In public memory, the tank remained what it had always been: adequate, numerous, and overshadowed by more dramatic machines. The reason was simple. The improvement that mattered most did not look like victory. Wet ammunition stowage did not produce spectacular battlefield footage. It did not create decisive duels or iconic moments of destruction. Its success was measured in what didn't happen: fires that failed to ignite, crews that lived, tanks that stayed present. Those kinds of outcomes are easy to overlook. Historians and soldiers alike tend to focus on weapons that destroy more efficiently: firepower, armor thickness, kill ratios. Survivability is quieter. It leaves fewer dramatic artifacts behind, but by late 1944 and early 1945, the evidence was unavoidable. Sherman tanks equipped with improved ammunition storage were burning far less frequently than earlier variants. Crews were surviving penetrations at rates that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Units were maintaining effectiveness through repeated engagements, and yet German forces never fully understood why. This was not because the answer was unknowable. It was because intelligence, timing, and assumptions aligned against discovery. German technical intelligence had once been excellent. Early in the war, new enemy weapons were captured, disassembled, and analyzed with impressive speed. But by the final year, that system was exhausted. Specialists were gone. Resources were diverted. Fronts were collapsing. The few Sherman tanks that fell into German hands intact were usually older models. Newer vehicles were recovered or destroyed by American crews. The sample never reflected reality. This created a feedback loop. German commanders interpreted battlefield behavior through outdated data. Each engagement reinforced old beliefs rather than challenging them. Penetrations were achieved, therefore the tank was still vulnerable. The absence of fire was treated as anomaly, not evidence. That delay mattered more than ignorance ever could. Even if German commanders had identified the wet stowage system in late 1944, their ability to respond was limited. Adapting tactics requires time. Time requires stability. Germany had neither. Meanwhile, American forces continued benefiting from a solution many of their own crews did not fully understand. This was the paradox. German forces fought an enemy whose capabilities they misunderstood. American crews used equipment whose life-saving feature they often couldn't explain. The gap between understanding and effect widened with each passing week. After the war, when former German officers were interrogated and battlefield reports analyzed in full, the picture finally became clear. The Sherman had not become harder to hit, it had become harder to eliminate. That distinction explained much of what had puzzled German commanders during the final campaigns. Why anti-tank tactics seemed less decisive. Why American armor stayed present under pressure. Why momentum never truly stalled. The lesson was not about American brilliance or German failure alone. It was about the nature of modern warfare. Wars are not decided solely by who builds the strongest weapons. They are decided by who learns fastest, adapts quietly, and protects experience long enough for it to compound. The wet stowage system was not a revolutionary invention. It was incremental, inelegant, almost mundane, and that is precisely why it mattered. It did not seek to win the war in a single moment. It sought to reduce loss, preserve skill, and extend endurance. Those goals rarely make headlines, but they decide outcomes. The Sherman's transformation was never meant to be dramatic. It was meant to be practical, to give crews a chance to survive their first mistake, their second hit, their worst day. In doing so, it changed how the war was fought, even if few recognized it at the time. The lesson remained buried beneath louder stories of guns, armor, and heroics. But it was there all along. The tank that everyone remembered for burning had quietly become something else entirely. Not unstoppable, just survivable enough to matter. When the war ended, the Sherman did not receive a dramatic reappraisal. Photographs still showed burned-out hulls. Veterans still remembered fear. Historians still compared armor thickness and gun caliber. The myth of the bad tank endured because it was simple and because it was partly true. The Sherman was never the strongest tank on the battlefield. It was never the most heavily armored. It never won by intimidation. What it learned to do, late in the war, was something far less visible. It learned how to stop killing its own crews. That change did not turn the Sherman into a miracle weapon. It did not spare every life. It did not guarantee victory in every engagement. But it altered the balance of endurance who stayed, who learned, and who could keep fighting tomorrow. A tank that burns teaches nothing. A crew that survives teaches everything. By preserving experience, the Sherman preserved momentum. By preserving momentum, it shaped campaigns. And by shaping campaigns, it quietly influenced how the war ended in the West. The most important lesson of wet ammunition stowage was never about water jackets or engineering diagrams. It was about priorities. The Americans did not win by making the Sherman unbeatable. They won by making it forgivable by allowing crews to survive mistakes, hits, and bad luck long enough to adapt. German forces never fully understood that shift while it mattered. They kept fighting the tank they thought they knew. By the time the truth became clear, there was no time left to respond. History remembers weapons that destroy dramatically. It often forgets the ones that simply refuse to fail when they should. The Sherman story was never about dominance. It was about survival, and how survival, repeated enough times, becomes decisive. If you were a Sherman crewman in 1944, would you trade speed and performance for a better chance to survive being hit? Or would you rather take the risk and fight with a better tank on paper? Tell me what you would choose in the comments.